te iwi and welcome to a special edition of Playmakers. I have a special guest today who has taken on some leadership roles at some of the most prestigious sporting organisations both here and in Australia. Along the way, she's become a trailblazer for women in these positions, and now she's returned home to New Zealand, taking on the Chief Executive role at Sport New Zealand. Her name is Raelene Castle. Kia ora, Raelene.
Kia ora.
Thank you so much for giving us your time today. I understand you're a busy woman now in your new role.
My absolute pleasure, and it's great to be back and great to be here at Sky.
Awesome. I'm going to start with the word leadership, and it's a word, it's a statement, but what does that mean to you?
It's an interesting word because I think people often confuse it with management, and I think those two things are really different. I think it's the ability to take an idea or a concept or a plan and take a group of people with you so that they can flourish in their own way, be the best that they can be, bring together the best team that you can bring together, and then deliver on whatever it is that you're planning to do. So whether that's in a sporting team environment, whether that's in a business environment from a leadership point of view, or whether that's even in an orchestra, for example. So it's that ability to take a group of people and make them the best that they can be to get to an outcome.
Now, leadership, of course, if it was easy, we'd all be doing it. We'd all be sitting in chairs such as yours, but it's not. And there have been some tough times in your experience in recent time. When looking at your experience with Rugby Australia before you started there, what was it about that job that excited you? What did you want to bring to the table?
Yeah, I did a lot of due diligence before I accepted the role, and the thing about rugby is it's an international sport. It has the third largest sporting event in the world with the Rugby World Cup. It's diversifying really well. It's got a great men's program international, but it's also working really hard to grow its women's program. So there was a lot of things about it that were hugely exciting. The Wallabies were an incredibly strong brand that had some great history and some great performances over a long period of time, probably inconsistent and not as consistent as they'd like to be. So that was a real challenge, and I looked at it and thought, why wouldn't I have a go? Like, what did I have to lose? It was an enormous opportunity with a great brand and some really good resources.
Yeah, and when you did get that role from this side of the Tasman anyway, it seemed like, quite the celebration, and especially for, we see one of our, mana wahine on the stage there taking on this top role, feeling, extremely proud of you. And at the time, it looked like you had the buy-in as well of them, that organisation and the fans. But it seemed like there was a little bit of a shift.
Yeah, I think there was. I think one of the things that's always difficult when you take on a CEO role is that you get employed by a group of people, mainly the board and the board that's in place, and they support you into your plans because that's why they've appointed you. Over a period of time, those things change. That's what happens in sporting organisations, how you have a governance structure appointed. And I think it is one of the ongoing challenges that you have in a sporting environment is that you have enormously passionate people that have very loud voices and very strong views on what it might have been like in the past, and the view that they want it to either remain like it was in the past or they think there should be certain voices around that were there previously. So to think about the change that all sport needs to go through, it wasn't just Rugby Australia, it's many sports, even here in New Zealand, and the change culture they've tried to go through to bring governance into a modern environment and bring some different type of leadership into sport can be really challenging. So, I had 2.5 years of great support from the board and a really an opportunity to deliver on the plans that I had said that I wanted to deliver on. And then there was a governance change, and there were some people on that board that felt that they needed someone else, some clear air to take the conversation forward. And ultimately that was when I resigned. So yeah.
When you look at the things, there was a big highlight on some of those, key moments that we'll talk about a little later, that, kind of pushed you to that decision to make in the end. But when you look at what you achieved at Rugby Australia, what were they and what can you walk away from being really proud of?
Yeah, I think the two main things were, well, there's probably three things. One was to try and bring the sport together at a whole of game level, so have all the states and territories across Australia feel like they were part of Rugby Australia and that they were all contributing. Because if you think about the challenges that Australia would face, the rugby programs that you have in New South Wales and Queensland, very different than what you have in a South Australia or a Tasmania, for example. So there's a huge breadth of difference. So we wanted all of those states and territories to feel like they were part of Rugby Australia, and I think we achieved that. Secondly was introduce a high performance structure, which meant there was integration from the 16s and from Rugby Australia point of view, representative team, 18s into 20s, into Super Rugby and into Wallabies. So that was an aligned structure where everyone worked together towards one plan, had some leadership that allowed it to integrate. So we brought in Scott Johnson, who had that overall role of integrating the Wallabies, but also thinking about signing that really strong young talent that we had that got runner-up in the under-20s to make sure we'd secured that so we didn't lose it, because that was a real challenge for, unlike here in New Zealand, different challenges. We have a lot of poaching from Rugby League and sometimes from AFL, so it's about securing the best talent and then appointing a coaching team that we felt had the capability to go through for the next 4 years. So that's a platform that, if it stays in place, should give us a stable ability to grow good Wallabies in the future with a consistent idea of what Australian rugby looks like. And the third thing was some free-to-air broadcast, which was, I didn't get to finish the broadcast negotiations, but they've now completed them, and the new guys have done a really great job to find a partner that's prepared to deliver a free-to-air option, because it's a very different market in Australia, and when your two biggest competitors being AFL and NRL have significant free-to-air options for people to engage with and fans to engage with, when you don't have that option, it makes it very difficult to find profile and relevance.
So how do you try, I mean, especially while being the CEO, try and, I don't know, show people that, you know, if you give this time, that this will succeed? How do you try and change that, you know, those old kind of thinking heads?
Yeah, it's like any change. It doesn't matter what business you're in or what change you're actually going through. You have to communicate a lot, and that's take the story, spend time with the people that are going to be affected by that change and communicate with them. So we did a lot of work inside Rugby Australia around that communication, the same as I did when I was CEO of Netball New Zealand, and we made a significant structural change around how we went from 12 provinces down to 5 zones. So that was a significant change, and I did a roadshow all around New Zealand, and I went and stood in front of every sort of province and gave them an opportunity to come. We did a presentation about why we thought the change was right, and then we allowed people to ask questions, and I was prepared to stand there until the very last question had been asked to make sure that they had air all their grievances, really have a good debate. If I couldn't answer the question on the spot, I would say, I can't answer that, but let me find out for you and I'll come back to you. So people then feel that they're engaged in the process, and I think that's the piece that is the best way to try and get people to change with you, is to communicate really well and give them a chance to be involved as part of the process.
It just seemed like, though, because, I mean, it's not like, you know, how we can sit down now and chat about it. We could only see it through the media lens about what was happening, and it looked, you know, very serious, that there was a logging of heads, and that what you were trying to send in terms of your message about that just wasn't getting through. There were, you know, words like bullying and arrogance and all these sorts of things. So how were you coping with people's decisions on things when they didn't quite see your vision? How did you cope with that?
Well, I think one of the whole challenges in having arrived back in New Zealand now for 6 weeks is the number one question I've got asked is, oh my goodness, you poor thing, how did you cope? And the reality is that it wasn't like it was shown in the media. So yes, there was some portions of the media that had a very strong view, either that I shouldn't have been the CEO, maybe that they should never have had a woman appointed in the first place. And so that always coloured any suggestions or any changes or any recommendations that I made. They had an agenda, they wanted to express their views, and it didn't matter what I did, how many times I met with them, when I went and talked to them, nothing was really going to change their view. So the challenging thing is when the general populace is reading that media coverage, and for every negative story, there was another journo that was writing either the facts or some sort of supportive, constructive. It's just that the negativity often drives the headline these days. I mean, and that's one of the real challenges, clickbait, and if you have a negative headline that's sort of controversial or exciting, then that's where you get the click. When you read the story, often it doesn't really stack up. So that was difficult because the reality of what we were dealing with inside was not like that. So what we were doing within rugby, the people that we were dealing with, the stakeholders, the states and territories every single day, it wasn't that sort of crazy washing machine that the media would have suggested it was. Ultimately, though, perception can turn into reality, and that was, that was a real challenge that I faced, and I tried really hard, but just couldn't find a way to actually calm that, some of those loud voices.
Talking about that, Israel Folou, how did you react when you found out about that tweet?
I was really disappointed. Yeah, personally and professionally. My view was that we'd had an agreement that Israel wasn't going to use that language again, so that was disappointing. I felt compromised because I have a responsibility as the Chief Executive to provide a safe working environment for everybody, and that includes people of diverse views, which also means you're trying to create an inclusive environment. And those two things are often quite challenging. So if you think about diversity and inclusion, in some ways they're a bit like oil and water, so they don't always naturally come together. So people say, oh, it's easy to be inclusive. Sometimes it's not, because people's differing views are very confronting and challenging for people inside an environment. So how you deal with that is to have people express their views or their opinions in a respectful way. And ultimately, that was for what was an incredibly complex issue, and there has been millions of column inches written about it, both in New Zealand, Australia, and also internationally. It was really simple. There was an employment contract which we believe was breached, and there was respect was not shown. The language wasn't in a respectful manner. So it wasn't to the values of Rugby Australia, of which inclusion was something that we held up and continue, to really think is an absolutely critical value in today's modern society as we move forward and think about inclusivity. So yeah, it was really difficult. I've sort of joked that when I started the role, I didn't think I'd end up as a university case study in every sporting university about how to deal with a sports star that uses a social media platform for his own views. So there was lots of learnings. I don't think we got everything right, and there will be many people, and I've had many of my colleagues, whether they be in sport or in business, say to me, oh my goodness, we went and had to look at our HR policies and suddenly think, my goodness, how would we deal with this if that happened to us? And would we have the capability of deal with it? And how would we deal with it? So it really was something that created an enormous amount of conversation because it affected everyone in everyday life.
You mentioned that oil and water reference, and that's really what it looked like from the outside. He was very staunch in what he believed in and expressing that belief. And you were very staunch on policy, but as you say, being inclusive. Was it like that behind the scenes? Did you get along? Did you know him at all as a person?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I did, and we had a number of conversations beforehand, obviously, and then we had the first tweet, so I had a lot of conversations with him around that, and then we had the second tweet. So yes, it was difficult, and I think, the ongoing challenge was that we had a lot of very deeply religious Polynesian players within the environment, and how do you assure them that they are absolutely, I'm proud of the fact that they're deeply religious people and they choose to express that in a way that is prayer before a game or prayer after a game or, prayer classes during a tour. That's fantastic. And they were engaging and welcoming and wanted to be part of that. But it was done for them behind closed doors when they wanted to do it. And I think that's the piece that, in a respectful way, of they invited everybody in the team to be part of that. Anyone, religious or not, strong views could come to the prayer class or the prayer group and be part of that. It was an open and welcoming environment, and you could choose. That's what I see as being inclusive. So that inclusive nature, regardless of what your personal beliefs are.
You talk about going through this with Israel and things like that, but there was already an existing connection with Maria through Netball New Zealand. Was she a part of the wider circle at all?
Oh, I mean, that's a difficult challenge, and I think it is one of the challenges as a leader that you have to balance friendships and personal connections with what the right thing to do is as a leader. And I got some really great advice from my mentor, who said to me, when you're in these positions, he said, be authentic, be real, form good relationships and friendships, but don't get so close that you can't kick their ass. And that's obviously as an example of that, is that ultimately I had to make a decision, and Rugby Australia had to make a decision that was in the right interest of Rugby Australia. So personal relationships weren't relevant because, and does it make it hard? Of course it does. But the reality is you've got a job to do, and that's what you're tasked to do, and you have to step up and take that responsibility.
When you look back at your experience at the Bulldogs, at Rugby Australia, your tenure over the ditch, would you do it again if you had the chance and they said, hey, do it again? Would you?
Absolutely.
And why would you?
Because I'm a much more experienced leader now. I've had met some incredible people that have taught me a lot. All sorts of experiences that you get when you do these types of roles is truly incredible. The opportunities that you get to meet great people all over Australia, and you see how hard volunteers are working in small places to do great things for rugby. And so I wouldn't change any of those experiences. Equally, there was some great times. We were lucky with the Bulldogs in 2014 to go to a grand final, which is just an experience that you can't possibly explain to anyone, the craziness of the Bulldogs fans when they make a grand final, and painting the houses blue and white and cars blue and white, and partying in the streets with drums and dancing, and the streets blocked off because of the whole week of celebrations. You couldn't those are experiences that I'll take with me forever. So no, I wouldn't change it. Of course, would you make some decisions differently with the benefit of hindsight? Of course you would, and you'd be crazy to say that you wouldn't. But overall, I loved both roles. I met a lot of great people, and I'm a much more experienced leader because of those experiences.
When you look at, you burst on the scene with Netball New Zealand, being in, that CEO position, and then you took on, an NRL franchise in Rugby Australia, which is in contrast, totally opposite. Netball New Zealand is fundamentally run by women, and then you went and did the total opposite in Australia. Did you experience any sort of inequality or sexism or things like that? There were reports that was perhaps a reason why you opted out of Australia in the end, but did you experience any of that over there?
Well, interesting, I started my career in corporate Australia, corporate New Zealand rather, and a lot of that time I worked in male-dominated teams. So the whole movement from coming from, it was almost weird to go to Netball New Zealand with lots of women, so that was more the exception. So I think then going into the environment where there was lots of men was not as strange as people might actually have thought it was. Did I experience it? More of it behind my back than to my face. And I think time is important. So initially there was a lot of reservation and concern, both when I went to the Bulldogs about, oh my goodness, this is a woman, like what's that all about? But when you get to know people and they understand who you are as a leader and what you're trying to achieve, and recognise that you're inclusive and you want them to be successful, and you're starting to build that environment, then people take a big deep breath. And that doesn't really matter whether you're female or male. That's what happens when a new leader comes into an environment, because it puts people on edge. I'm not naive enough to say there wasn't an overlay of the whole sort of negativity, and there was some social media platforms that I never read, I didn't look at, I just didn't, because the people that don't know you have an agenda that is very sexist or misogynist, and that's really, and they've got no real interest in changing. But I think the people that you're working with every day, those are the people that you can influence to try and change those outcomes. So, I'm not someone that sweats the small stuff or gets really anxious about the things that someone's writing on social media, because I can't control that, and they don't really know me apart from what they see on the TV or read about in the newspaper. So it's the people that I work with every day, that's the opinions, the board, the staff that I'm working with, those are the opinions that I really value. So yeah, there was certainly some overlay in the media environment that was certainly leading into some, other people have labelled it, that made my job much more challenging. But it was the people I worked with every day. It was their opinion that was really important to me.
Yeah. Did you get much of like a culture shock? Was it very different? Was the environment very different? We've touched on, being a woman in male-dominated organisations in Australia, but was it, very different culturally?
It's interesting. It's enormously different and not that different, if that makes sense. So I think there's no doubt it's bigger and brasher and there's more people, and so that it's more transactional. So, but particularly Sydney, because it's a big city that makes life very transactional, so people come and go and all of that. So I think that's different, where I think the talent pool's deeper, so people tend to come and go more quickly. If that person's no good, you get rid of that person and you get a new person. Where here in New Zealand we tend to have, and I see this a lot in our sporting environments and our sporting teams as well, our depth is not always as great, so we can't just roll the next one off the production line. So we have to approach it in a different way. We have to nurture, we have to put our arm around them, might be a bit more patient. And I think that's true in business as well. I think we're more inclusive and supportive, and we look after our talent and make our talent want to stay with us for longer periods of time. So I think you see a lot of the differences, interestingly, in the business environments reflected in the way we deal with our sports teams as well.
And while you were in Australia, was there anybody around you, like-minded like you? Were there other women in your position that you could go, hey girl, how's it going? Were you able to have those comfortable conversations with other women in your field?
Well, it was one of the things that I didn't realise would be so difficult when I first arrived in Australia. The first was I had a really supportive and strong network here in New Zealand and in Auckland, and that 5 o'clock, got time for a glass of wine, I just need to chew something over conversation. And I arrived in Australia and I realised I didn't have any of that at all. So it did take me some time to build that up. And after 7 years, I had an amazing network that I will miss hugely now that I'm back here, and I'm hoping that the travel bubble will open up at some stage so that we can, still continue to engage and spend time with those people. But that was something that was quite difficult to start off with when you don't have that safe network to have those conversations with. But I'm lucky now. I think I've got 2 networks, one in New Zealand and one in Australia, and I know they'll continue to be valuable for me.
Do you look at your position? I know you're quite staunch on, I'm not just a woman in my position, I'm here on, my credentials, and I'm really good at what I do. But in terms of, of this perspective, how important is it, you're the CEO of Sport New Zealand, a woman, that representation. Sky Sport now has a female CEO. We look at Jenny Wiley at Netball New Zealand. How important is that in the normalising of this?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is, that great line, if you see it, you can be it. So it's that when young women see somebody that's being really successful, they look at it, and it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's in the sporting field or administration field or a leadership role, and they think, I believe that I am capable, and I can see I've got a role model where I can look at. So I think that's an incredibly important part. There's no doubt, in an healthy active sense, the women and girls is a real focus for Sport New Zealand, because it's mum that always doesn't look after herself and looks after everybody else. So how can we make sure that we have opportunities where mums and women and girls can have opportunities to be active? We have a drop-off at about between 13 and 15, and we want to make sure that it might not be organised sport, it might be, but it might also be those other wellness options about exercising, choosing healthy lifestyles, because it's that communication and making sure that women and girls are getting the same opportunities that the men are getting. So yeah, I think it's an important mix. New Zealand's done an amazing job of promoting gender, or not even promoting gender, normalising gender. If you look at, Jacinda Ardern, if you look at Governor Generals that we've had through the years that have been women, I think we've probably had more female Prime Ministers than any other country in the world. I mean, that's amazing. So it normalises a whole lot of conversations for young girls coming through environments. And now we have to make sure that, from a Sport New Zealand point of view, that they are getting the support that they need to have the active lifestyles that they want to have.
Well, I think people will agree with me in saying thank you for staying in sport, and we can't wait to see what you do at Sport New Zealand. It's exciting stuff for the future of sport in this country.
Thanks for having me.